A person who's just starting out with watercolors realizes very early on in their journey that watercolors aren't the easiest medium to work with. Hi everyone, my name is Cheryl and I'm a self-taught watercolor artist from India. In this video, I will present to you various hacks which I wish I knew as a beginner. The first hack is to start wet on wet. We always paint from darkest to lightest, so it helps to start with this technique. Wet the entire paper with clear water so that it's completely soaked. The second hack, use light washes first to retain the moisture on the paper. With a light wash, you use a lot of water to dilute the pigment, and when you place this on the paper, it helps the paint to blend and also it helps to retain the moisture on the paper. While the paper is still moist, you can add more and more of these blended light dilute washes, and with time you can intensify them. Remember that it's always easier to intensify darker colors with watercolor than to remove a dark pigment and make it lighter later on. Always preserve your whites in watercolor because the paper's white is the only white we have for this kind of medium. The third hack, use dry on wet for soft details. For this, take a very concentrated pigment on a relatively dry paintbrush and place them in areas where you would like to have blended details. So for instance, these marks on the seashell were very soft and therefore I wanted to keep them blended, and so I did it while the paper was still wet. Use a splayed brush for fine lines. For this technique, spread out your paintbrush like so and load it with pigment, a very dilute pigment initially. Then use this splayed out paintbrush to make very fine lines on your seashells. This kind of texture could also be useful for other paintings other than seashells and is a neat technique. It helps to create the impression of fur in animal portraits as well as in bird paintings. So you can see how soft and blended these details are, and that is because my paper is still wet. As you can see, some of these splayed lines cross the boundary beyond the shell and blend into the background. But that's alright because I'm going to use a very dark background later on. The fifth hack, layer for richness. So in watercolors, we obtain rich colors only through layering. You can see that watercolor is a transparent medium, due to which it's difficult to build intensity in a single layer. So where you have laid down shadows earlier, you would like to intensify those colors wet on wet so that the painting stands out and looks vibrant. Before you add a new layer, you need to wait for the previous layer to dry completely. You could also use a damp brush to blend in some of the details like you can see me do here. This is a clear paintbrush which has all the water soaked out using the paper towel. I also take this opportunity while my paper is still wet to add even darker details, and you can see how I am working from the lightest to the darkest color. This is how watercolors work. I made a small mistake there which I try to correct, and it's not always possible to rectify mistakes in watercolors, but we will get to how mistakes can sometimes be rectified. Hack 6, negative painting. To paint the background, I use this technique called negative painting in watercolors. To get crisp edges for the shells, first I let the paper dry completely, then I wet only the background and I add pigment around the seashells to get crisp edges for the seashells. I soon realized that the ultramarine is true darker color for the backgrounds, so I also add a bit of brown and allow it to blend on the paper. You can continue to lay colors for as long as your paper stays wet, but if you notice it starts to dry, then allow the paint to completely dry, then wet the paper again and start over. A drying paper can create blooms if you place wet pigment on it. The sixth hack is to let colors mix on paper. This looks more organic than mixing it on the palette and then placing it on the paper. On a wet surface, if you're using the wet on wet technique, the paints will naturally blend and mix with each other, and that gives a very beautiful and natural look. Here I use burnt sienna over the ultramarine to create a very dark shade. For the background, I like to keep it dark so that my shells can stand out against it. Once again, I let my paper dry completely, and that brings us to the eighth hack, which is to use a white watercolor pencil to smooth out the surface of the seashells. While I was laying down the background wash, some of that color crept into the seashell and gave it a jagged edge. Besides, because my hand was a bit unsteady, some of that pigment entered the seashell where it was not supposed to. And I am rectifying those mistakes right now with a white watercolor pencil. I dipped the tip of the pencil into a jar of water to get it to melt, and then I place that melted pigment onto the paper and give my shells a smooth boundary. And once the boundary is smooth, for the first shell, I use the very same technique on the second shell. This can take a bit of time to lay down enough pigment onto the paper, but patience is key in watercolor. You don't want to rush your process, and you really want to take time to step back and look at your painting every now and then to see if you're satisfied or if anything needs to be changed. White is a good way to cover up mistakes from what I have found. Before I started this painting process, I taped down my paper to hold it in place, but even then, when you add water to the watercolor papers, you will notice that the paper buckles a bit, which is why, even though I have cleaned up my borders, it still looks a bit curved. Once the paper is completely dry after my painting process, these surfaces would look a lot smoother. So it's just a matter of waiting for the page to dry. We now come to our ninth hack, which is to use a damp brush to blend dry on wet. So for instance, that little bit of space between the two shells is something I would like to cover up with the dark color of the background. But if I just paint like the way I am painting right now, it would leave a bit of hard edge at the top and bottom where it meets the wet on wet layer. To smoothen out that edge, you can use a damp brush. The 10th hack is to intensify your colors once you have placed your background and once you know how your subject looks relative to your background. So this shell could use a bit of shadow to the bottom. So I wet the surface, I blend the edge, and then I lay down some more colors. This is just the same as layering, except it's done at the very end when you have a bird's eye view of your painting and a good idea of how your work looks. I also paint some of it wet on dry and leave some hard edges to give eye-catching details to this painting. Stepping back from the painting and looking at it once again tells me that this right shell is missing a bit of shadow to the bottom, which is what I add now. I make it darker through layering, and I go from a light shade to a dark shade gradually and not all at once. I also add some more shadows to the left shell, and with that my artwork is nearly complete. I need to blend that edge, and it could also use some shadow over there, just like so. Just accentuating the spirals of the seashell makes it look more realistic. Once your painting is done and dry, the next hack is to use white gouache to create crisp highlights on your painting as well as cover up any further mistakes that you might have made. So with my thinnest paintbrush, I take some of the white gouache and I selectively place it at certain places, usually where the darkest colors are. Right adjacent to those dark colors, I place my lightest colors because that helps the painting pop. It's possible to also blend gouache just like you blend watercolors. I do this for both the seashells, so you can see how that white highlight that I just placed really makes this shell stand out. Once your painting is bone dry after the painting process, you can remove the masking tape. For this, it helps to apply an oblique pull or pull it in a slanting manner like so. This prevents the paper from tearing when you are removing the masking tape, which is a very common problem that beginners face. Pulling it this way in a slanted manner leaves your paper undamaged and the end result looks great. So those are all our painting hacks and I will see you in the next one. I hope you enjoyed and found value in this video, and if you did, please like, subscribe and share this video.